All right. I think now it is recording. I'm hoping so. All right. Well, great to have so many of you here this morning. I know I've had people telling me that it's like, ooh, I'm interested in this topic. And let me give you a little bit of background on how I landed on this. And I didn't bring that book with me, but there's a book that the Synod put out a while back, basically with our official stance, like in our bylaws, resolutions of the Synod, on all kinds of different topics, like our stance on abortion officially, and so on. Stem cell stuff, euthanasia. I mean, kind of those hot button kind of topics, right? So that was my plan, was to start a study called Hot Topics, just taking one of those and going through. Sure enough, I look at it, the very second page was our stance as a Synod on anti-Semitism. It's like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. I felt like that. So I'm going, by the power of the Holy Spirit, hopefully, do justice to this very large topic, okay? And I felt like it was very important for us to understand just the history, not only biblically, but how did we get to this point as far as Israel as a nation now in that place, right? And all that's been going on. There's just so much from the biblical times to the intertestamental times to the time after Christ with the Crusades and things like that. We'll talk about some of that. And then more recent times, as far as, if you're unfamiliar with how the current nation of Israel got started, I think it's important to understand all of that. And then, try to, as best we can, try to put a bow on, okay, how are we supposed to understand what's going on there and our relationship with Israel as the church, the Christian church today? Okay. So, if I can get this to work. Okay. Now, I'm sorry this is so this is really frustrating. So I brought a brand new one of these because I thought that was the issue with the old projector. That was not working. I tried two different projectors. Corey Brand brought this projector from home, but for some reason it's real dark. So I'm going to have to play with the brightness with it, but just haven't been able to do that because he just got this set up for me. So anyway, can you see it at all in the back? I know it's kind of hard, kind of. Yeah, I wish that it was brighter. And I know there's a way to do it on here. I'll just have to play with it. So bear with me. Obviously, I'll be reading, sharing what's on here. But here's what I'm hoping to accomplish. I'm hoping to accomplish several things with the study. One, we're going to explore the biblical history behind the establishment of a nation called Israel in the Promised Land and how the current nation of Israel came about. Two, we're going to ask the question, who really is Israel today? The answer is it depends on who you're talking about. Okay, and I'll get to that. Three, how should our knowledge of who is Israel affect our stance toward the nation of Israel today, how to view the present conflict as American Christians? Okay, and I know there's a way to hide this. Let's see here. There we go. Well, it's focused. It needs to be brighter, and I think there's a way to do it here, but it may take a little while. Well, that's not the issue. That would only make it bigger. It wouldn't change the brightness factor. That's what needs to change with it. On the other projector, it was brighter. So I don't know whether it's just the way it's set up. But anyway, but I was trying to do it on the projector because it's bigger, obviously, than the TV. So anyway, so who really is Israel? We have to start at the beginning, of course. And it starts with the call of God to Abram in Genesis 12, right? Or Abraham. Now remember, Oh, here's somebody jumping on here. So remember, prior to this, there were 8 people who got off the ark and began to reestablish civilization, right? Noah and his 3 sons, their wives. Chapter 10 of Genesis records who were born to the 3 sons of Noah after the flood. And of course, they progressed quickly in their civilization to the point where they are working together to build the Tower of Babel. We all know that story, right? Okay. So they all wanted to stay in one place, but instead of filling the earth as the Lord had directed. Now God confused their languages, of course, and they were forced to disperse throughout the earth. One of those sons of Noah was Shem, who eventually had a descendant named Terah. Okay. Now we know that Terah grew up in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. Let's go ahead and look at that real quick. Open up your Bible, Genesis 11. And read what it says about them there. So Genesis chapter 11, starting at verse 27. If anybody needs Bibles, we've got extra ones here. Anybody else need Bible? Anybody? Couple? Right. So Genesis chapter 11, starting at verse 27. Says, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his father-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Now, did you catch anything interesting about that? Where were they headed to? Canaan. But for whatever reason, they stopped in Haran and never got there. So Abram was supposed to be in the land of Canaan, but he never. Now, to give you a little bit, now once again, I should have. I should have tried to have this up here, but so Ur is clear down here where Babylonia's up here, right? Babylon is right up here. Okay. Now, Ur was you call Ur of the Chaldeans. In other words, the Chaldeans were the group of people that lived around that area. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is it might have been not far from where the Tower of Babel was built. Here's why. So in Genesis chapter 11, it talks about how the Tower of Babel was built in the plain of Shinar. Now, we aren't sure exactly where Shinar was located, but it eventually became the location of the kingdom of Babylon because there's a reference to it in Daniel 1:2 that's where Daniel was, because that's where Babylon was, right? So essentially, the Babylonian kingdom ended up being built where the Tower of Babel was initially being built, okay? So the important thing about that is that Terah and then his 3 sons come from that region. They were going to go to Canaan. They stopped in Haran. And we're not, it doesn't tell us exactly why that's the case. But here's the important thing about this. The Chaldeans are a people who fought for Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, in 2 Kings 24. It describes the people whose capital became Babylon. And they're mentioned many different places. right? Like, for instance, you don't have to turn there, but in Daniel, the first chapter of Daniel, it does say this. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. He brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So when the Babylonians overtook Jerusalem back in 587, that they, of course, took vessels out of the temple, took it back to Babylon, right? And that's where the capital was of their kingdom, in the land of Shinar, which is the same as it says the Tower of Babel's built, okay? And if you were to look at all the references to the Chaldeans, they are a very warlike kind of people. And that's where it says, going on in Daniel 1, verse 3, then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, used without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent stand in the king's palace, and teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So what they are forcing Daniel, as an Israelite, right, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to do was to learn the language of the Chaldeans, because they were the ruling people through Babylon. Questions about any of that? Now you might say, what does this have to do with Israel? I'm getting it. Okay, all right. So therefore, Terah came from the land where the ancient ancestors of the Babylonian kingdom came. We know they developed their own religion there. And in Joshua 24, verses 2 and 14, tells us Terah and his family worshipped other gods, which would have included Abram, his son. Okay, that they were idolaters. They worshipped the gods of the land. Okay. Now, the fact that the Lord had to call someone who worshipped other gods to make a nation out of him could imply that things had gotten bad again in the world, like before the flood. They called someone out of his paganism in order to make a nation out of him. And there was a purpose behind this. Okay? Now, this is important for the discussion of Israel, because this is where the idea of God setting aside a nation for himself comes into the picture. He would make Abram and his descendants into a great nation. So look at Genesis 12. Verses 1 through 3. Says, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I'll make of you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So you wonder, even though we don't know, could perhaps Terah and his family have kind of renounced the gods of that land, and that's why they were going to Canaan, but then they stopped there in Haran instead of going all the way, but they were meant to go all the way. I mean, we just can't know for sure, okay? But the fact is that as they settled in Haran, so Ur is down here, okay, on your map. Haran's clear up here north. Of course, Canaan's clear down here. Right? So Haran, Canaan. Yep. So they go clear north and settle there. So they're there, and that's where God gives this call to Abram. I want you to leave there and go to Canaan. Okay? And that I'll make you a great nation, right? And all the families of the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Okay? So he's faithful to the call of the Lord at age 75, and he goes and settles in Canaan there. And it's in verse 7 of chapter 12, where it says, Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Right? So that's where it starts, where the Lord said, okay, to you and to your offspring, I'm gonna give this piece of land, even though there were people already living there, of course, the Canaanites. Okay. And why does he call them? Why does he call him? That all the peoples would be blessed through him and his offspring. Ultimately, it would be fulfilled in Jesus, the seed of Abraham. And we see that connection in that actually in the text, it's offspring. We saw it like in Genesis 22, where he repeats this promise, but he doesn't say offspring in the plural. He says it in the singular. Paul picks up on this in his letter in Galatians, where he very much sees the interpretation of that is that's referring to Jesus. Okay. Now, obviously, he does actually give it to his offspring, plural. But in a sense, really the land was to be Christ. Think about it. But anyway, okay. So they were to be a people set aside to have influence in the nations around them. And we'll get to that in future studies. This, of course, the promise the Lord would give Abraham offspring, and they would be given the land of Canaan. The only land Abram actually possessed, however, in Canaan was his burial plot. We see that in Genesis 23. He purchases it from a man on the land to bury Sarai, his wife, Sarah, and then later on he's buried there. But of course, throughout Genesis, you have this promise confirmed over and over that God would give him the land. We see it in Genesis 15. We see it in Genesis 17. We see it in Genesis 22. Okay. In fact, go ahead and just look real quick at Genesis 17. Genesis 17, verses 1 through 8. It says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. And Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful, and I'll make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I'll establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I'll give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Okay? I will be God of the land. Now, what's important about this is if you skip back to Genesis 15, right? Abram here, God says, I'll be your shield, your very great reward. And Abram's convinced it's going to be Eliezer of Damascus, one of his servants that's going to be his heir. God confirms, no, he's not going to be your heir. A son from your own body is going to be your heir. And if you remember what happened in Genesis 15, God makes a covenant with Abram where he puts him into a deep sleep. First of all, he takes these animals, he cuts them in half, puts the pieces opposite each other. He puts Abram into a deep sleep, and then God passes through the pieces in the form of a smoking fire pot. And it was to establish covenant. Now, the Hebrew word for covenant literally means to cut. How you made a covenant or agreement was to literally shed blood, to cut a covenant, right? And the significance of God passing through the pieces, that basically in ancient times, leaders would do this. They would take animals, they'd cut them in half, put the pieces opposite each other. They'd pass between the pieces, shake hands, and be like, if I were to break this covenant promise with you, I promise to do to myself what has been done to these animals. So who initiates the covenant in Genesis 15? The Lord. Abram's a completely passive recipient of the covenant. It's God who passes between the pieces and says, to this land I am going to give to your ancestors. Now, Genesis 17 is now Abram's part of it, in that this is his circumcision. Literally, he's being cut, blood is being shed for his part of it. Okay, I've initiated this covenant with you. I'm going to give you this land. Your part of it is to be circumcised, and this is my promise. My covenant promise sealed in blood. Okay, questions about any of that so far? Okay. So this is what God continues to confirm throughout the scriptures. He also confirms it in Isaac's life. But now let's skip forward to Jacob, okay? So Isaac obviously is the child given to him miraculously. And then Isaac has the two sons, Jacob and Esau. And from the moment of their birth, we're told the older is to serve the younger. Jacob's the younger, he comes out pulling the heel of Esau, right? And that's why he's named Jacob, heel puller, a cheater, so on. But now, look at Genesis 28. Now, I promise there's a purpose behind all of this as far as where I'm going, okay? Look at Genesis chapter 28, starting at verse 10. So, Genesis 27 is, they trick Isaac out of the blessing. Rebekah helps Jacob trick her husband, and Isaac gives the blessing to Jacob when he thinks he's really giving it to Esau. Okay. But of course, Esau's reaction is he's extremely upset about this, hates his brother. It says in Genesis 27:41, now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, then I will kill my brother Jacob. But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said, behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now, therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban, my brother, in Haran. So now Jacob's going back to where the family came from, where Abram was called, to the Canaan, right? Okay. So now he's set off by his mother, right, to be, because of Esau's hate, his pledge to kill his brother. And so he's all alone on his journey back to Haran, which is quite a ways from the land of Canaan. So verse 10 is where we're going to start. Genesis 28:10. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place. This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So he gives them this experience of this dream. And what does the Lord promise him? He's going to be with him. What's that? He's going to give him the land, and you're going to leave it, but what?
We'll bring you back.
I will bring you back. I will safely bring you back, right? And you're going to inherit it. Now, this is important going forward. So Jacob has this dream and this experience. Then, of course, if you know the rest of the story, he ends up back in Haran. Of course, his uncle tricks him with Leah and Rachel and all of that. And he has the 12 sons. You know, we know all that story, okay? But now we're going to skip ahead to Genesis 32. So now Jacob has his sons. He has his 2 wives, the concubines, right? The servant girls. He now comes out of Haran with lots of possessions of you know. Remember, he left basically with nothing except for himself and whatever he brought to survive on until he got to Haran. But later on, he tricks Laban, of course, if you remember that story, as far as getting a lot of his flocks. So now he leaves and he's got lots of possessions to go back to the land. But the story is that he's got to go through the land of his brother, the Edomites, where Esau and his descendants settled. Okay? So look at chapter 32. Okay. Let's start at verse 6. So Genesis chapter 32, verse 6. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him, and the flocks and herds and camels, into 2 camps, thinking, if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant, for which only my staff I crossed, for with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, meaning the first time, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So imagine being in Jacob's place here, right? The Lord has seen him through the trial with his uncle. He comes out with lots of possessions. He's coming, but now he has this fear of his brother and what's happening to him. He's vastly outnumbered. So what's he pray for here?
God's help.
God's help, and that you will keep the promise you made to me. Right?
Like
okay.
God forgot.
Like God forgot. Honestly. Yep. So what happens after that? Jacob then sends a present, gets the things together for his brother Esau, sends it ahead. He's preparing for the worst. And then this is where we're coming to for our main study this morning as it relates to Israel. Okay? Look now at Genesis 32, verse 22. So what happens is Jacob ends up sending his wives, his servants, and everything ahead of him across the Jabbok River. But he goes back. He stayed in the camp at night. Now, the reason why he probably made them cross at night was for their safety, right? Knowing that if they were attacked while trying to cross the river or something like that, that would be worse. But he stays back on the other side of the river. Why? Verse 22. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives and 2 female servants, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. So Jacob's all alone. And it's the middle of the night. Why do you think he does that? Okay, he was all alone in the dark. He had this vision. Okay, that very well could be, right? That he's hoping maybe for another vision like that. Yeah. But why does he say this prayer? Why is he doing this? Because he's very afraid. He's probably wrestling with the Lord in prayer. We see his prayer earlier than this, right? And so he's staying up all night, you know, worried about it, probably praying about it. So here it is, the Lord, masking himself as a man, goes and wrestles with him. Now, was this experience answering Jacob's prayer? I think so. Okay. Because interesting detail, when it says a man wrestled with him, Moses uses an interesting Hebrew word. A commentator by the name of Wenham writes, the verb he struggled occurs only here and in verse 25 as clearly a play on the name Yabak or Jabak, and probably Jacob too. So we could paraphrase it, he Jabaked him or he Jacobed him. In other words, they struggling, right? Jacob is struggling with, Lord, are you going to come through with me? Come through for me here. You've made this promise. I'm praying to you that you will. Right? So at first, Jacob doesn't know exactly who he's wrestling with. It's in the middle of the night. Could he have thought Esau at first? That's how some people maybe take it, but who knows? But in the light, he recognizes it must be God by his response. Now, the man asked Jacob his name, even though he would have known as God. He wants Jacob to state his name that he might rename him Israel. Also, to bestow a blessing. The blesser must know who he is blessing. By asking his name, Jacob reveals his character, what his name means, cheater, heel puller. But God doesn't want this to be the name Jacob and his people will always be associated with, but rather to carry the name Israel. Now, the question is, why does the Lord give Jacob this experience? What was it supposed to mean? Well, Martin Luther says in some of his writings on this, he says this text is one of the most obscure in the Old Testament. But I think the important detail in the story is that Jacob stayed behind during the middle of the night to probably wrestle with the Lord in prayer. He was greatly afraid. Would the Lord keep his previous promise to him in Genesis 28? He had not arrived in the land of Canaan yet. He had to go through his brother's land first. Remember, last time he saw Esau vowed to take his life. So in many ways, and I don't know if I had thought real deeply about this until I was really studying this again. This is Jacob's Abraham and Isaac experience. Think about that, right? God tests Abram. Do you love me more than your own son? Right? Jacob has faith in his Lord. He's prayed about this, but yet there's kind of a hint as if it's like, okay, you know, I hope that you'll make good on this promise. Please deliver me from the land of my brother, right? And so on. That he perhaps needs this kind of as his own kind of a test of faith, and coming out of it on the other side, the lesson to be learned from, right? A test of faith, the Lord doesn't just let him wrestle with him in prayer, but literally lets him wrestle with him. Notice it lasts all night. The Lord lets Jacob think he is winning until he simply touches his hip socket and puts it out of joint. Well, he doesn't know. It's this mysterious figure in the night. He doesn't know until the morning light, right? Because if you look at it, says, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. It isn't until that point, okay, when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, right? The man, the Lord, I guess. But see, he's letting him do this for a purpose. Because then when it's like, okay, he's prevailing against me because I'm letting him, and then I'm just going to touch your hip and I'm going to show you who's in control here. But yet he lets Jacob wrestle with him. Okay. Now I'm going to get to the explanation of that in a little bit. So the Lord lets Jacob think he's winning until he simply touches his hip socket and puts it out of joint. He's showing he had the power and ability to win the match at any time, but he lets Jacob wrestle for a while thinking he is winning. The test was going to see how Jacob would react to now knowing he was defeated and helpless. Think about that, because once he puts his hip socket out, right, he's done. I was reading something else like that's a trick of wrestling. I don't know if maybe you're wrestlers or something, that evidently, there is a way you could kind of wrench somebody to essentially, put out your opponent if you needed to, right? If things aren't looking good. Notice the man demands that Jacob let him go because it's daybreak. Jacob refuses to let go until he blesses him. Somehow in the midst of struggle, Jacob recognizes this man has the authority and power to bless him. He recognizes he is his inferior, right? That bless me, which would seem like that's an awfully odd thing to ask somebody you've been wrestling with all night, right? Oh, by the way, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. So somewhere in the struggle, he must have realized who this is. But think about the significance of this. Jacob now is completely clinging in desperation to his God. I'm not going to let go until you bless me. Okay? Now, this is one commentator's take on the sequence of events. He says, God didn't want Jacob, and he doesn't want us to be timid with him. He delights to let us win victories over him on the basis of humble, believing prayer. Jacob clung in faith to God and to God's promise, and he received the blessing he desired. Now, this is the way that Martin Luther interprets it, which I really think this is really interesting. He says, God in his boundless goodness dealt very familiarly with his chosen patriarch Jacob and disciplined as though playing with him in a kindly manner. God plays with him to discipline and strengthen his faith, just as a godly parent takes from his son an apple with which the boy was delighted, not that he should flee from his father or turn away from him, but that he should rather be inclined to embrace his father all the more, and beseeching say, my father, give back what you have taken away. Then the father is delighted with this test, and the son, when he recovers the apple, loves his father more ardently on seeing that such love and child's play gives pleasure to the father. Isn't that an interesting take from Luther? As if it's like this is like a heavenly father wrestling with his son, giving him the opportunity to kind of wrestle with him for a while, showing him, you know, I, I'm in control here, but yet letting him have this experience of perseverance of faith. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay. That the fact that he won't let go. Now, this is one interpretation, of course, but it would seem to make sense. There's a lesson that Jacob is supposed to learn from this, given the context. His heart wasn't completely full with faith and trust in the Lord. He still had some doubts. His wrestling match with the Lord showed Jacob who was in charge, but yet showed him a fatherly love. He lets Jacob win until the time when he is meant to learn. It was experience Jacob needed for his faith, but also as he would become a father of a nation that would have to wrestle with these same questions. Is the Lord going to be there for me and protect me even through the scary times? Right? So the Lord then renaming Jacob Israel was to be a constant reminder of that night and experience. Think about that as they would carry that name throughout their history. Also, it'd be a reminder to the nation that would bear that name. They would strive with God and with men, but prevail or conquer. As the name Israel means in Hebrew, he strives with God, or literally, like one of the commentators I was reading, it really should be translated more God strives or God fights. Literally, it says God El is the shortened Elohim's the Hebrew name for God. When it's combined in a word, it's shortened to El, like Israel, Daniel, Ezekiel, right? All of those names all have that as the root, something related to God. Okay. So, but God fights, he fights for his people. Now, why is that such an important name here for Jacob in this moment? If God is for us, who can be against us? I've got you. I've got you. Right? I'm going to carry you through this. You can trust, absolutely trust my promises. Right? And put your full faith and trust in me. Because had God said in his dream, I will bring you back here safely. Absolutely. But Jacob still has to pray. Okay, Lord, do this for me, please. Right? Absolutely. Absolutely. Luther says this about this renaming. This man exercises, or in other words, like wrestles Jacob until true strength and firmness of faith shows itself. For this reason, he changes his name. He says, your name shall not more be called Jacob. You were previously called a trampler, right? Or a, heel puller, kind of cheat because of your brother, but they have not yet imposed your true name on you. Your name will be Israel, for your fortitude and invincible strength of heart by which you have conquered God and men have merited this. In other words, in the end, he did not let go until you bless me. So God had promised the blessing to Abram. He'd promised the blessing to Isaac. He'd promised it to Jacob through the blessing of his father. Right? Look back at Genesis 27. We're going to start at verse 28. So Genesis 27, starting at verse 28. This is what Isaac said to Jacob in his blessing. It says, may God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So now Isaac thinks he's saying that to Esau, but he's really saying it to Jacob. And what is he telling him here? What's that? Okay, you will be a blessing, but that nations will bow down to you. But also, who else will bow down to you? Your brother, your mother's sons. See? So he'd had that blessing from his father, right? Which would, what's that? Well, that's what Isaac's thinking, but the Lord's using and speaking through Isaac to really bless Jacob. It's really, in a way, the Lord speaking to Jacob here. So he'd had that promise there. He'd had it in the dream, but now it's like, okay, I'm going to let you wrestle with me for a while until you really get this. See? Right? But that it was something, I think, that Jacob needed, and that all of his ancestors would need, to look back on that, their forefather, and that test of faith. It's like, okay, it'll be a constant kind of tension between God and his people. Who's really in charge, right? And so on and so forth. But that story, the very name they carry, was to always remind them, it's God who fights for you, right? I will be there for you, and put your faith and trust in me. So another commentator named Wenham puts it like this. His old name Jacob recalled his past underhand dealings. His new name Israel recalled this incident in which he wrestled with God and prevailed. Thus, his renaming as Israel is not merely an honorable accolade, is itself a valuable gift, a blessing. Right? The name itself is a blessing. Whenever his descendants heard this name or used it to describe themselves, they were reminded of its origin, of its meaning, that as their father triumphed in his struggle with men and with God, so they too would eventually hope, to triumph. Within this episode, his new name is a guarantee of a successful meeting with his brother Esau. I've got you. And that's exactly what happens. Jacob now received the blessing of his father, but perhaps did not fully trust the prophecy's words. We already looked at that, Genesis 27. Now he receives the blessing from God himself. Would he believe it and trust it fully now, knowing he saw God face to face, and yet his life was delivered or saved? Later on, God tells us no one can see his face and live. So God permitted this. He masked himself so Jacob could have this experience. Just like Jesus was basically the Father with a mask on, right? Coming amongst us to be his presence in the flesh. One greater than the temple had come. So why is this passage important for this study? This is where the name Israel originates from, and its context is important. The descendants of Israel would always be characterized by this name. It would be a constant striving between God and them as far as who is in charge. Would they put their full faith and trust in him and recognize dominion over them and submit to his will? Or would they constantly strive against him with pride, arrogance, and resistance to his word? The rest of the Bible tells us the story. But our faith should be placed in the God who fights. And that's where I'm going to stop today. Questions about any of that?
Is Jacob really he runs away from his brother Esau. He runs away from Laban.
Yeah.
I mean, he isn't a God. I mean, he doesn't seem to be a person that wants to. He runs away from the person. It's just, finally he's wrestling with God.
Yeah, he wasn't the hunter, right? He was kind of the soft one, right? Of the two brothers. And so there could be that aspect of it too. That's like the Lord's kind of toughening him up. I mean, if you think about it, like that, preparing him for what is to come a little bit, and that, you know, I understand the fear that's in your heart.
God changes. Not Jacob's
Right.
nature. It's God changing us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mary. Yeah, you'd think so, probably. Yeah. Any other comments, questions? So this is where I wanted to get us to for today. So then we'll follow, okay, where does it go from here, right? Biblically. And I know this is something a lot of you know the history about, but I feel like, it's important to get us to the point of seeing all the times where Israel was overtaken, the temple destroyed, it's rebuilt, the city's rebuilt, right? Over and over until the time of Christ, right? It's never been rebuilt since then, the temple. And in my opinion, now some would argue with me on this, right? That I just don't see the temple being rebuilt again because it's no longer needed. See? But well, because the term for temple in the New Testament that Paul uses is the Greek word naos, which is like the sanctuary, like the Holy of Holies in the temple. Who is that being referred to in the New Testament? It's the church.
Well, the temple was a place for sacrifice too, and the
Right.
sacrifice is no
No longer needed. So in a sense, as the Spirit of God dwells within us as believers in Christ and in the church, God's holy presence is wherever we are as the church. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with you, because my presence is with you. Okay? And that's where we're going to get to who really is the Israel in the New Testament. It's really the church. Okay. But I'll wait till we get there. So I hope you guys will continue to, yes.
That's all tease.
Yes.
But I think who has said this all along, as Christians, why do we really care what happens to Israel? Because they turned their back on it. So the church is now the believers, not Israel. But I know there's other reasons that Christ came through them.
Yep.
And that's how I feel they are. But they're and it's like, we have no Christian.
Right. And that's where I'm going to get to down the road. Is there is good reason to support Israel, maybe not always in the ways that we think as the church per se, but that so yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. Yes, Monica.
I was just talking to a private member and told me how we could get money for different things that we're doing in our church. We could get 200. First of all, question: is anybody in this room a private member? Okay, I'm a little bit excited because we can apply for $250 card. You can do it twice a year. Okay, that's $500 each. Then if you're husband and wife, it's $1,000. And you can apply online And it's a very simple process. I have to go through it and look through it again because I'm pretty excited about this. And towards any benefit, like towards our preschool that we did for the car show, you could get $200. And if they give you a credit card, like a Visa card, that you can spend it on, like the food for the car drive, the this for the car drive. We have a benefit release redemption coming up. You can apply to get $250 to go towards the food for the benefit, or to make baskets for the benefit, things like that. So I'm going to be, after you're done, if you come here and give me your name, and I can get this information to my coach.
All right, thanks, Monica. All right, well, let's close the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thine kingdom come, thine will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is kingdom, power, and the glory, forever and ever.
Amen.
All right, thanks, you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.
What's that?
Thank you.
Well,
That's like-
until I kind of keep putting it together,